Hello and welcome back. Sorry about that. We had to just make sure that our hair was exactly as we wanted it to appear. Perfect. On camera. No, seriously, actually, I just had to restart one of our demo servers, and it took a little bit longer than expected to get that restarted inside of the lab. It may not have come back, and we might have to just work around that a little later on. You might see one or two of the rough edges. However, this next section we're going to be taking a look at managing iOS. We've already covered the introduction to the toolkit. We've explained what EMS is and some of the things there. We've gone through some of the fundamentals that you need to have in place in order to be able to do management of iOS and Android. And now we're going to take a look at actually managing an iOS device. Just to prove it, I have one right here. So we are going to take a run through what we can do with managing iOS. The very first thing, of course, is to think about setting up the way we're going to structure this module. We're going to start off by talking a little bit about enrollment and provisioning. I just want to give the identity section a little time, so we've moved that a little later. That's the server that I needed to restart. So we're going to first go through enrollment and provisioning. Then we're going to take a look at some of the policy that we can put in place for an iOS device. Then we're going to take a look at iOS management application management inside of iOS. And then we'll have a look at the unenrollment process. Some of these pieces have changed really recently as just 2 weeks ago. And some of the changes are not completely obvious when you're going through the UI. We've just made some minor enhancements under the hood that make things work a little bit differently. So we're going to take a look through all of those updates. So as we start off, we're going to be talking about enrollment and provisioning. So what are we talking about? What's the idea here? Well, as Kevin mentioned earlier, enrollment is a little different to registration. Registration is the idea of actually identifying a device within our Active Directory. Enrollment is actually adding the MDM capabilities to the device that Microsoft Intune actually gives us and enables. When we look at the ways that devices get enrolled, there's actually a couple that come into play. The first one that most people will probably be relatively familiar with is actually the idea that we can do bring your own device style enrollment. So if you go on an iOS device, go into the App Store, you'll find that we have a Intune company portal published there. And from that point, we'll do a demo of this later, but you can actually go and enroll that device into management with Intune, or in fact Intune with Configuration Manager. However, bring your own device is only one part of the puzzle. Not everybody likes bring your own device. Not every company has adopted a bring your own device methodology. So there are lots of companies that still do company-owned, company-issued devices. And in those cases, well, the use cases for the devices tend to be different. For company-owned devices, we see them being deployed for task worker style scenarios. So you've probably been into a restaurant where they've had an iPad and they've maybe taken your order on it. They maybe found the seat that you wanted to be placed at. Or maybe you've been flying around the US and you've sat at one of the bars in US airports where actually your menu is actually an iPad device. Those kind of places, we want to have a way of being able to do a very, very locked down and restricted approach to what can be run on the device. However, other areas, maybe you just bulk buy all of your Apple devices and you want them to be configured. Well, we've got some options there. We can actually do bulk enrollment first with a service account. This is actually very similar to doing an enrollment with a bring your own device type of approach, in that what you actually do is you log onto the device, go into the company portal, and then you enter your enrollment details. But instead of entering your enrollment details as simon@contoso.com, you're going to enter it as details along the lines of device manager@contoso.com. And the difference is that a device manager account can add as many devices as they want to be able to Intune or to Intune and ConfigMan, whereas a normal user account, you actually limit the number of devices that an individual is allowed to add. So it gives you an extra level of control. And of course, because you're using a specific service account for that provisioning, you can provide a specific set of policy and profile just for that one user account to apply to the device. Other options, we can support the Apple configurator. So that means that we can produce a very, very custom lockdown profile using Apple's configurator. We'll go through how a little later on, in order to be able to do a device enrollment. And finally, we also have a tie-in for Microsoft Intune to Apple's device enrollment program, which means that you can actually buy a device which has been pre-enrolled into your MDM solution with Microsoft Intune, and which it's impossible for the user to unenroll that particular profile. So that puts us into kind of a very cool managed place. So as we start to think about what we can do on those managed corporate-owned devices, well, the first one, we can provide a custom iOS policy. That actually means breaking open the Apple configurator and building a policy just for that particular device. It means being very, very granular about the approach. We can go through the approach of doing device lockdown. Device lockdown enables us to lock down the device by providing a specific set of policies, like a kiosk policy, for example, for that particular user, or in fact for devices of that particular type. And we can set up the queries inside of configman or Microsoft Intune in order to be able to do that level of understanding. We can also target apps to specific devices, so we can make sure that an application that you want to be installed on a device is installed on that particular device. And, very importantly, that it's taken off when the device gets unenrolled. And we can also make sure that on certain devices that we actually have a list of applications that you can and cannot use, an application install or an install, allow and deny list. Now, that's an interesting situation because on iOS, actually, it's very difficult to enforce the allow and deny list. The operating system doesn't really do that. What it does allow you to do, though, is get rich levels of auditing over when a user has broken a policy, for example, around installing an application on a device. Of course, if you go down the configurator route, then you can completely take away the ability to install specific applications. However, you're not going to do that for maybe those devices that have been enrolled using a service account or that have been enrolled using the bring your own device method. So the very next thing is the experience, and what does it look like on these devices? Well, we have a company portal experience on every single platform, on Windows Phone, on iOS and on Android. That's that single pane of glass that Kevin mentioned earlier. It allows you to have that one thing that you say to your users, hey, just go and get the app from the company store, from the Apple App Store. It allows them to be always a very centralized place to go and get that from. And then when they sign in with their credentials, which obviously are going to be their same credentials that they're using for their on-prem PCs, their Windows PCs, anything that's signing into Active Directory, it's going to be using exactly the same set of credentials to get them into the company portal. So they're going to see things that you've set up, like your company branding. They're maybe going to see a multi-factor authentication request. They're going to see anything that you've put in place around your Azure Active Directory. You also have the ability to completely customize that application portal. When we were setting up the configuration manager connection back in our fundamentals module, you actually saw me setting things like the color. We've picked that really nice magenta color that we're going to be using across the entire environment. Actually, it also allows us to put in things like company logos. Again, you want to be doing that because it really starts to build the user's trust that IT are doing the right thing and that they are using the right account credentials and they're using the right environment at the right time. One of the other things that we've actually done is we've put in place a new way of thinking about enrollment. And this goes back to a little problem that we started to notice that folks had inside of enterprises. And I have to say, every time I talk about this, I put my hand up as being completely guilty of having done this in the past. You guys have probably done this, but let's just see. Imagine you're in an IT department and you're having a really interesting negotiation with the HR department around service level agreements. So, how do you make that negotiation go smoothly? Well, you notice that the HR director who you're talking to has a nice, shiny new iPhone. And you're thinking, they'd probably really appreciate company email on that device. So what you do is you give them the details for the Exchange ActiveSync server. Well, you've just entered into a world where you've just allowed information about your company to flow to a device that you know nothing about. And actually, you may have very little control over the device. You're just going to have the policies that you apply through Exchange ActiveSync. So this is a kind of an interesting area to get into. We have free-flowing information going to anybody who has access to a username and password that works with Exchange ActiveSync. This started to make us think about, actually, what happens here? Well, why don't we make it so that when somebody takes a device and rolls into Exchange ActiveSync, that the very next thing that we do is we actually quarantine their account. We stop them getting emails until they've added MDM functionality to their device. It's perfect in a bring your own device style environment, and it solves one of the biggest kind of issues that people have been coming back to us with. It's also one of those places where we use that conditional access approach in order to be able to access information inside of your company. So if we take a look at the conditional access for Office 365 slide, we're building this out for Office 365 right now. It's already available in on-prem, as we'll see in a moment. So what actually happens in this set of circumstances, our user enrolls their device, they connect up to Office 365. Office 365 then talks to Azure Active Directory and says, hey, is this device managed and is the device compliant? Well, actually, Azure AD turns around to Office 365 and says, hey, no, there's a little bit of a problem here. The next stage that we go through is that Office 365 then says, I'm going to block the device, and it puts it into a quarantine state. The user then receives a single email saying, hey, we've quarantined this device, and it gives them the details about the device. And it's done as an email because they'll see it on their device. It's the last email they'll receive on their quarantine device, the last email they'll ever receive on their quarantine device. They'll also receive it everywhere else that they're already able to access email, so they'll know immediately that there's something to do. You can customize the body of that email to say whatever you like, but you could, for example, say, I want to provide the details on how to enroll the device. So then we move on to the next step. What happens? Well, the user then goes and gets hold of the company portal from the App Store. They install the company portal and they add their details, therefore making the device managed by Intune. Intune then tells Azure Active Directory that the device is now managed. In turn, Azure AD tells Office 365 that the device is managed and it's connected through Exchange ActiveSync. And then Exchange unblocks or unquarantines the user's access to email. Something very, very similar happens when we look at this in place for an Exchange on-premises environment as well. In Exchange on-prem, which is what I'm going to show you in a few minutes' time, we can do very much the same kind of flow. We actually go through a slightly more direct approach, really. So in this case, the user adds their device, but the device is blocked as an unmanaged device from between Intune and Exchange. Intune actually talks directly to Microsoft Exchange in this environment. Then the Exchange server turns the connection off. It stops the user from being able to use email on that device. Then the very next step, once they've read their email, is they're going to go ahead and they're going to go to the portal and go and install it, enroll their device, and then Intune will know about the device. Intune is actually pulling information from Exchange, and it's seeing from Exchange that there's a device that's already been enrolled, and it can see then that there's a new record for the same device with the same serial number assigned to this specific user. It'll then match the two things together and say, actually, this user is now okay. So it'll tell Exchange to unquarantine the device. And that all takes place by using a connector which you install onto your Exchange servers, which does all of that work for you. It's a really simple process, but for the end user, it's really, really easy and intuitive to run through. They're actually just going to receive an email. The email's got instructions in it. It might even name an individual in your organization to contact, or it might list your help desk number. It might list the exact app to go and get from the store in order to be able to do the enrollment. So what I want to do now is show you how this works. I've got an iPad over here, and I'm just going to grab hold of it and make sure that we can see the screen. So hopefully we're seeing. There we go. Yeah. So here's our iPad. This is a currently unenrolled iPad. What we can see, if we go into Profiles on an iOS device is where we can see all of the management profiles that have been applied to a particular device. So as it gets enrolled, as it picks up an identity, as it picks up corporate email, VPNs, we're going to see them appear in here as management. However, if I go just down to my mail and contacts, you'll see that I've added manually an Exchange account for this lorry@fakeurlco.com address. Now, unfortunately, with this being an iPad, I can't really zoom in to things that are going on the screen, but let's go ahead and dive into Laurie's email. She sees a couple of email messages here, and she's just trying to do a quick resynchronization. Her device has actually already been blocked. So this morning, when we were just prepping, I added both an iOS and an Android device because This flow that I'm showing you on an iOS device also works in exactly the same way on an Android device. And we'll take a look at that a little later on. So we're just waiting to see if it's going to be able to check for any mail. It is actually probably going to fail as an endpoint. So the very next thing that I'm going to do is go to the App Store and get the company portal. Now, to save some time, I've already downloaded it, so we'll go into the company portal. And you can see here that Laurie has actually signed in already. So you can notice though that next to Laurie's name, we see a little flag with a number. That's actually indicating that she has one device which is not actually enrolled into the environment. So let's just, before we have a look at enrollment, have a quick look at the app itself. We can see at the bottom here we have access to all of the devices that have been enrolled for this particular user. So in this case we can see that Laurie has an iPad Air, she also has an Android device and a Windows Phone device. So if we go and select the Android device, for example, from here we start to see a couple of other nice features. For a start, I can rename it. Perhaps I don't call my Android device Laurie Android, I might just call it Android. So this is just a friendly name that the user is going to see so that they can identify their devices. But notice she can also do a remote reset or a remove of all of the information on the device. The reset option is kind of the nuclear option. It's going to blow away all the information on that device. The remove is just going to take away all the business data on that Android device. We'll get to what that's going to do a little later on. I can do the same thing on a Windows Phone device, and I can also do the same thing on an enrolled iOS device. This, however, is not an enrolled device. So let's just click the device and isn't enrolled message. It then says to me, hey, you need to enroll your device. So I'll tap on enroll, and it's going to take us across to the enrollment portal. It says, hey, I found the management profile. Let's go ahead and install that. The user then taps on install. They then need to type in their super secret password. And having done that, they're prompted to install the profile. I say install. Generates the unique key, enrolls the certificates for management. Tells the user that they're going to have to install this management profile. Okay. Hit install again. Then we have to say that we want to trust the remote management. We'll say trust. And that takes us through the process of enrolling the device. Now, of course, the user didn't need to be any training in order to be able to do that. They just received an email that said, go to the store and enroll your device. Now that that's done, Laurie's got access to all of the iPads that she's ever enrolled. She's got access to the Android devices and the Windows Phone devices. She can also go into the apps menu and she'll see any new apps which have been delivered to her device. And she'll see any apps which have been published out. She can browse those by category. You'll notice that we're not actually seeing any apps appear at this point. Now there is a reason for that. In a few seconds time, we're going to actually see another pop-up appear. And that message is going to say that Fake URL Co. are going to be pushing out some applications to this iOS device. And that's going to move us on into another section of this presentation. So we'll let this actually just sit there and cook slowly in the background. Email, however, will also begin flowing in a few moments' time. Right now, it's still blocked. But what will happen is that Microsoft Intune will work out that the device has been added to Exchange and it's been added to Exchange ActiveSync and to Microsoft Intune. It'll tie those two bits of information together and it'll allow conditional access to our email. Let's just take a look at what that looks like from inside of the company portal, from inside of the management portal experience. So I'm going to just go ahead and sign on to that from my desktop machine, hopefully. Let's use the right browser.
We need to look at your screen though, huh?
We will do in just a sec. Yeah, let me get to the manage.microsoft.com. Okay, let's sign back in as our admin. For this one, I'm doing fake URL.co.com. Oh, nope. Definitely going to spell Microsoft correctly. Micro, S-O. There we go. And sign in. So right now we can see that actually we have one device which is blocked from Exchange. Let's go and investigate that that blockage, and it's actually showing that in fact it's just an aberration that's left over right now inside of our console. However, if we go into all devices, all mobile devices, we'll see everything which is being directly managed by Exchange, in which case it's showing as a Windows Phone device. And if we have a look at everything which is being managed by Exchange ActiveSync, we'll see the iPad and the Android device. Now, we've just added the iPad, so in a few moments' time that will actually start appearing inside of this direct managed group. It'll take a few minutes for everything to work its way through, and that'll actually appear. Once it appears in there, and the same device is also showing up in all Exchange ActiveSync managed devices, that will allow that conditional access. Now, of course, we don't want to be just applying things to every single device inside of our environment. So we also need to think about what else we can do with management of our iOS devices. So if we move back to the presentation again.
Okay. Sorry, I was answering a question.
Ah.
All right.
Okay, so hopefully we're back on the slide deck. There we go.
Identity.
Okay, so let's just see if the identity section is going to play ball. So let's just bear with me for a second. Let me sign in over here. Let's do that. Okay, we can get to that part. That's good. Oh, we're getting that as well. Let me see if I can just put my URL back together. Ah, okay. We're going to skip through the identity section. We'll come back to that a little bit later on. So we'll move on to talking about the mobile device management and the capabilities that we have there. So if we can move back to the deck for a second. There we go.
You want to talk about bulk enrollment?
Yeah, let's talk about bulk enrollment. So we've just seen the ability to enroll a device using the bring your own approach. You could also use a service account to be able to do that. But we have options for being able to do bulk enrollment as well. So in this case, we have our bulk enrollment manager. Whoops. So what this enables us to do is to create a manager inside of our Intune environment, and then we can use that in order to be able to manually go through all of the devices that we want to apply all of our custom policies to, and enroll them into our management environment. So we'll take a look at this in detail when we look at the Android enrollment, because this is also available for enrolling Android, and it was just an easy way to split things up. But we'll literally sign into the portal with the Business Manager account, and it'll apply all of those different types of policies for each one of the applicable places we might want to use this. So anywhere that we're working in a kind of a kiosk style environment, this is going to be perfect for. However, when we think about bulk enrollment in an iOS world, we often think about the ability to use Apple the configurator in order to be able to do that. So that we can put that in place, what we actually have to do is connect up, download our device enrollment profile from Intune, add it to the Apple configurator, and then we can connect each device to the Apple configurator, which is specific software that you can obtain from Apple, in order to be able to do that enrollment. What this actually means is that when you use the Apple configurator, it's going to provide a very specific set of policies that you've configured at that point in time, so it'll be pre-configured for when you hand this over to the user. It will also prevent them from being able to take away the MDM management profile. So that means that you're in this situation where you're issuing company devices, somebody maybe comes to your IT department, you literally hand them over the device that you've configured individually with the configurator, and they don't have any setup to do themselves at all. And you've also restricted it completely down to just what you've allowed through the Apple configurator. You can then do things like application deployment directly from Microsoft Intune. So the two things can complement each other and work well together. And then finally, we have the ability to directly send the configuration from Intune over to Apple. and you can actually use the device enrollment program. So that means that as an enterprise, you can go to Apple and buy your devices pre-configured en masse by Apple, which might well be appropriate if you're deploying thousands and thousands of devices inside of your environment. Of course, you have to set up a policy link between Intune and Apple in order to make that happen, and you've got to do a key exchange with the Apple environment in order to actually set stuff up and make sure it works. So kind of a complicated process to go through. It's also a process where you have to have a pre-existing relationship with Apple in order to be able to set this up. Now, strangely enough, for the purposes of doing a lab and a demo, it wasn't possible to go and set up that pre-existing relationship with Apple in this case, so that would have been rather tricky to go through. But there's a ton of information on Microsoft TechNet in order to get you through exactly that process. So let's think about what we can do with regards to policy. Having thought about enrollment, let's think about how we can think about the ability to apply policy to our devices. What kinds of things can we do? Well, the very first thing is that we can turn on allowing or disallowing applications. That's kind of tricky in an iOS world. We'll get a good audit report back for that information, but it won't actually stop us from being able to apply those applications to the device. The device is actually, in Apple's idea, under the end user's ownership. Of course, if we've configured it with the configurator, or we've gone into the kiosk mode on an iOS device, then they're not going to be able to install it. This is purely for the capabilities that can be applied through Microsoft Intune. When we think about what mobile device settings categories we can manage through Intune, actually we can pretty much manage everything for an iOS device, with the sole exception of being able to manage Windows Server work folders. Now, I saw that we had a question inside of the Q&A a little earlier on about work folders on iOS devices. I believe that there's an application developed for iOS, but it's not yet published in the Apple Store. There's some kind of issue going on in the background there that needs to be worked through, so not entirely sure where that was, but we did show that application at TechEd Europe, so it should be coming along. In order to be able to manage that, though, we're going to have to do something around the mobile application management capabilities of Intune, which we'll see a little later on. However, inside of our mobile device management settings, we can do things like enforce a password to be turned on. We can't do anything with encryption, and that's actually not a problem on an iOS device. They're all encrypted by default, so that's a very good thing. We have a good state of encryption on iOS. There's also no anti-malware capabilities built into iOS. Hopefully, we're never going to see any need for that, but there's nothing that we can use there to manage. We can manage almost all of the system settings, including turning off things like Siri if we want to. We can also manage almost everything in terms of whether a built-in application such as, say, Photos can store photos inside of the iTunes cloud. We can also manage whether or not cloud backup is allowed on the device itself. Email is possible through email provisioning and deprovisioning, so we can set up all of the required settings for anybody's email to be automatically installed and added to an iOS device upon device enrollment. That's kind of interesting when we talk about the conditional access approach a little earlier. In the case of conditional access with email, actually, if the user deprovisions their account, they won't lose access to their corporate email. It'll re-enter that quarantined state. And the reason for that is actually that iOS doesn't allow us to remove an email profile that wasn't configured by MDM. We can't use MDM to remove a non-MDM profile. So it actually is still a nice, safe situation. When we start to think about configuring the browser, yes, we have the ability to be able to do that. We can also turn off gaming. We can set certain levels for what applications are allowed on a device. And that's always an interesting area. When you're thinking about maybe being more restrictive around what levels of child safety are allowed on a particular device, one thing that's actually always really interesting you should think about is that the users inside of your organization are probably going to be over 16. If, of course, you're in a school and you're working with kids, then you're going to probably set those to a little lower. But it's quite important in a business setting to set the level to at least 16 years. And the reason is that most business applications in the Apple Store, and also, for that matter, in the Windows Store, are actually marked as over 16. That's part of the implicit requirements of the business category. So you want to be quite careful. You don't want to accidentally block access to business applications purely based on the fact that you've blocked access to everything that is used by anybody that's over 8. So kind of an interesting thing to be putting in place. We can also configure features of the hardware, the cellular, the things, turning off things like roaming, all of those kind of things, and specific device features. And when we think about being able to deploy applications to an iOS device, we can deploy, well, everything you would expect to in that case. So we can deploy sideloading, we can do deep links, we can do web links, and we can do managed store applications. We'll come to that a little later on. So when we think about deploying the iOS policy, the first option is to actually take a policy, deploy it using the Apple configurator. It's also possible to upload a policy from the Apple configurator into Intune in order to be able to do that deployment. But the configurator lets you get very, very, very granular with things that aren't normally available through MDM management. As for device lockdown, well, it's all policy based. So we can set any of the policies that we've just talked about in order to be able to configure that iOS device. Let's think about application management for a moment. Application management on iOS is actually really pretty good. It has to be said, it's probably one of the best OSs for being able to do application management on a mobile device. If we start to think about the applications on a device, they come from a number of locations. Mainly they're going to come from the App Store on an iOS device. So it's going to be an application that the user has gone and installed. For the vast majority of App Store applications, there's not a lot we can do to control them. They don't have the inherent hooks in them for the application to be managed. So let's take, for example, an application like, right now, the Word application. Today, there isn't actually the implementation in Word for iPad for us to be able to do MDM-based configuration. That's actually something we're addressing with the Office for iPad applications and is going to come in the future. And the reason for that is we're actually building a software development kit, an SDK, that enables Microsoft Intune to have that capability. But it's not there yet for all of the applications. When we start to think about where else the applications come from, they also come from a side-loaded environment. So you might have a very custom line of business application that you do not want to be inside of the Apple Store. Well, you can actually sideload those. You can take the IPA files and actually be able to push them down to a device and have them installed. There's certain signing requirements around that, and actually it's probably more of a niche use case. You can also publish private applications inside of the iOS store. So they're actually published, but they're hidden from everybody. And again, just because you just need access to the link in order to be able to do that installation. Remains to be seen how all that's going to work with the volume purchasing from the App Store when that comes online, but that's another option. And then finally, we have the managed application option for Microsoft Intune. The managed application is a new way of being able to do our store application deployment. So we'll come to that in a second. Let's just flip back to the slides for a moment and just run these through. I just want to show you some of the things that we have that are built into the capabilities for managed applications on a device before we talk about how we get to managed applications. So the very first thing is that we can say that applications that are managed can only talk to other managed applications on an iOS device. So in this case, we could say that email is a secure application and it's only allowed to talk to other secure business applications. So in this case, maybe the Excel application. What happens when we try to move between them? Well, say we try and copy some information from an email into Excel. That could work. But then what happens when we try and push that information from Excel somewhere else? Well, we'll block that. We'll stop it from leaving that corporate management. What happens if we would then decide to take that into another corporate managed application? Yes, that's fine. What about if we try and take it outside of a corporate managed? Again, we'll block that. So you can see that the way that this slide actually builds, it kind of brings you to a fairly usual flow with what users try and do when they're trying to work around the controls that you've put in place. You can imagine that somebody sent themselves an email attachment, they then try to get some of the information into something else to work on it. That doesn't work. We start to just narrow that funnel so that they're only able to use the exact locations that we as the business have determined that they can. We can put this in place really easily by using managed applications on iOS, and I'll show you exactly how we do that in a few moments' time. So let's move through to the next slide in this set up and have a look at some of the flexible management options that we have for store applications. So in terms of the deep linked and external applications, the end user is always going to be taken to the store for those. And the reason for that is that really you could be pushing an application down to them where maybe it's an expensive application, maybe they have to accept a personal license agreement. So there has to be some way of invoking the store's approach to allowing that application to be delivered. In the case of those applications, it has to be user driven. So it has to be something where the user gets hold of the application from the company portal. We can use that with both free and paid applications, so you can use whichever particular approach you want to go through. But you can't apply a MAM policy, you can't apply an application management policy to applications that are coming from the public store in that particular way. The next option is to wrap them and actually make it a managed store application. So what does this mean? Well, the user doesn't need to go to the store in order to get hold of the application. We also get an installation status report back inside of the Intune console. Critically, we can push the applications down to the device. We can also only use this in the situation currently of free store applications. That may change in the future when we're able to do things with the volume purchasing approach, but we need to wait until that all lands. And then obviously we can apply mobile application management policies to those particular applications, and that could in the future mean that we can configure them very, very granularly. So that's the approaches. What are the different ways that we can get to these managed applications? Well, for Office mobile apps, which are obviously very, very popular, in fact, they are basically the most popular productivity apps on iPad and iPhone today in the App Store. We're going to be creating a natively managed version of those applications and actually releasing them in the near future. So you won't have to rewrap the application, you'll just be able to take it directly from the store. We're also releasing Intune Viewer applications. So we'll have a managed browser on iOS, we'll have a managed PDF player and a managed AV player and image viewer. Very handy. It means that we can always be sure that the PDF viewer that's going to be used is going to be able to use things like rights management. We can also make sure that that browser always maybe initiates a VPN connection back to an on-premises environment to be able to access the data behind it. The next option is to use a wrapping tool. Now the Intune wrapping tool, not yet available, will be soon, allows you to take a side-loaded application and manually wrap it so that you can have the policies that you want to put in place available to it. And then you can get really deep. There's the Intune SDK. So if you're a software developer and you're developing an application for enterprise use, you can actually build the SDK into the application and enable those deep management hooks. That's exactly what we're doing with the Office applications, so we have the deep application management hooks in place. So that takes us through to probably all of the steps. There's a nice pretty diagram around how all that works, but we'll just click through it very quickly to move us through that process. There we go. And then we'll move into the demo environment of actually setting up and deploying an application. So we're going to start this off on the iPad. And on my iPad, you'll actually see that as we completed our enrollment earlier, we've now got a managed application appearing on the device, and it gives me as the user the option to choose to cancel the installation or allow it. So I'm going to say install in this case, and we can see from the message that it's Word that's being installed. And then in a second or so, we should see exactly the same thing for Excel. Great. So let's allow those to go through. If I go back to the home screen, and I'll just see the two application icons for the two apps that are being installed actually appearing on my device. Let's now go ahead and just quickly move over to our Microsoft Intune environment, where we'll be able to see those applications. So if we go into software, what we'll very quickly see is if we go into manage software, we have Word, Excel published as applications in the iOS store, and you can see that they're managed iOS apps from the App Store. So let's go and have a quick look at what the details of these applications. Now, in order to do that, it'll fire up this Click Once application, which will run and then allow me to sign in again with my tenant details for Intune. in order to be able to do the management. Take another couple of seconds to run through. Okay, now let's do admin at. Okay, so you can see here that what I've actually done is I've provided an icon, I've provided some information, I've placed it into a category. So next, you can see the requirements. It'll run on any mobile device. I could have actually said it only runs on iPad. It's probably a more sensible place to do that. And we're going to say exactly how we want that to appear inside of the company portal. I'm not going to make any changes, but I am going to go and add another application. So let's go across to add software. Again, we'll just sign in. Let's go through the process of making a managed application. So we'll say next here. Then it's saying what type of software do you want to be deploying. In this case, we could be publishing an external link. So we would then just specify the link to the app inside the App Store. Let's go and say that we want to use a managed iOS app from the App Store. Again, we just need to provide the link. So let's go find one. Let's go and look for PowerPoint for iPad. And then let's just copy the link, go back to the software application, pop it in, and say next. So it's now recognised that that's a valid URL for an iOS application in the App Store. We'll enter the details of Microsoft and a name of PowerPoint. We're going to place it into productivity and we'll say next. We need to provide a description. Microsoft PowerPoint. I'm not going to provide an image for the icon at this time, but it's pretty easy to just take one directly from the web page. We'll say next. Then we can say what types of mobile devices we want it to land on. We'll say iPad in this case. Say next. And we're done. We've just wrapped the application for deployment. We now need to go and deploy that application inside of Intune. So we'll go back. And you'll see it hasn't yet appeared, but if we just hit refresh, in a couple of seconds' time, we should see PowerPoint appear. Okay, so there's our PowerPoint application. We now need to go and deploy the application. So we'll go to Manage Deployment. We're going to say who we want this to be deployed to. So we can say Device Managers, which is a group that we've created. I'll show you this later. That contains our device managers, or we could just decide that we want to deploy this to all of our mobile devices that are managed by direct management. Add access, say next. Now we say what we want to do with it. We're going to make it a required install. Say next again, and finish. That's now going to apply, that will now distribute that application to all of the iPads that are inside of that group. It's going to say iPad because I set the application only to deploy to iPads. It's going to deploy to everybody that has an iPad device that's enrolled as a direct managed device. I managed through Intune inside of the environment, and it will automatically install onto all of their devices the next time that they check for policy. And by default, checking for policy on an iOS device can actually take up to about 24 hours, and we don't have any control over that policy checking interval. So kind of a little bit annoying. But that's the overall approach to being able to wrap and deploy a managed application to an iOS device. So if we move back to our slide deck for a moment, we can think about what we're going to do with unenrollment. Essentially, we mean wiping a device at this point, but we need to think about the other things that might happen around device unenrollment. The very first thing that we think about with device unenrollment as IT guys is we want to actually nuke the device.
Yeah, that's what we don't want to do that.
Yeah, we don't want to be leaving this down to the user, but actually there can be really good circumstances where a user might want to be able to wipe their own device. I'm going to put my hand up again and say that I've done something else stupid. I was down presenting in Washington, D.C. not too long ago, and I had my iPad with me. I'd been using it. I was actually presenting from it, and I left the hotel, got on the plane, put my hand in my bag to get my iPad out. Not there. Not a great situation. I then thought back to myself, where had I been using it? Last time I actually used it was on the nightstand in the hotel, which is exactly where I left it. So what did I do? Well, actually, I got my other device, in this case it was a Windows Phone, out of my pocket, connected to the in-flight Wi-Fi, and sent a remote wipe to the device to get rid of it. In that case, I actually did a full remote wipe because it had my personal data on it as well as business data, but I was able to do that myself remotely. There are times when we want to be able to have that capability. So let's take a look at exactly that. If we start to think about being able to do this from that point of view, you need to be able to wipe it as IT. You also need your end users to be able to remote wipe their device from the actual device they're using or from other devices. So let's move into the next. Actually, we have another slide on the options for data removal. There are a couple of options that we have in place for data removal, and this goes back to why it's important to manage applications. So the first, full wipe. So factory reset, essentially, of the device. All of the data is removed and the device is reset to default. Users actually don't really like doing that. The reason is that they probably are going to lose lots of photographs of their kids, and it's not a nice situation for them to be in. So they prefer the idea of using a selective wipe. A selective wipe allows us to just take off the things that are marked on the device as being corporate data. So in the case of an iOS device, this means that we can wipe out corporate email that was provisioned through mobile device management. It means that we can take away applications that were provisioned through mobile application management. And it's typically what we'd use on a personal device that had been enrolled through a bring your own device type of approach. It's also actually a legal requirement in some jurisdictions to be able to do this on a device. It gets you into some really difficult legal ground when you accidentally wipe somebody's personal information out. So let's take a quick look at actually doing this on an iPad. So we'll move into the demo. I've actually got my things happening here. My email is now flowing, and the reason that I can tell it's flowing is I've received my device locked message. I'll receive any other emails that happen to come down from this point as well. If I go back into the company portal, how do I unenroll my device? Well, just go into Laurie's iPad Air. And before I do that, let's just have a quick look in settings and see what's appeared in our settings area. So inside of settings right now, we have a management profile. That management profile is for our MDM, and we can see the apps that have been delivered, Word and Excel, using that profile. And we can also see the restrictions, like the passcode, that have been put in place. So we can see all the policy as applied to the device. Let's go back to the company portal. I'm on that iPad Air. Let's hit the remove button. This is going to do the corporate data removal, and we'll hit remove. If I'm quick, I can go back into the device management portal, and we'll see from within the settings app, we'll actually see in a moment or two that the management profile will disappear, because one of the things that happens automatically when we do a device unenrollment, we actually push this out to the device. There we go, the profile has gone. So let's have a look at the impact of that. Well, my email has been added. It was already added to my device. I added that manually. That's still going to be in place, but obviously it's going to re-enter the quarantined state inside of this environment. Let's go back to the home screen. You can see that the Word and the Excel icons have also vanished from the home screen. They're not in place anymore. We've taken all of that information off of the device, and that's the capability that we have with being able to do a remote or local device wipe on an iOS environment. You might be thinking, what about the data? Where's the data gone? Well, iOS stores all of the data for an application inside of an application container. So when we wipe out the application, we essentially wipe out all of the data as well. So by wiping out Word, we've wiped out any files that Word may have been using, even if they're temporary files just used by the application. Wow, that takes us through a really long section on iOS. Let's have a look at some of the Q&A questions that appeared during that section. Is the SDK to manage Intune, or is the SDK to access Intune settings or policy within an iOS app? It's actually for the app to be wrapped with in order to be able to access the policy that Intune is pushing to the device. If you think about what kind of needs to happen in the background there, actually the application needs to be aware of the policy being pushed by Intune in order to be able to do something with it. It's not that the iOS as an application platform doesn't have a magical registry like we do in Windows that is a configuration location for all of those settings. We actually have to have each application looking at the exact right location for the settings of the application environment. Does it have local storage apart from user data so that users can work on a location with bad internet reception? Well, actually that's an interesting one. Once the policies have applied to a device, they're going to travel around with that device all the time until it's unenrolled. So once they've applied, they're never going to need to have internet connectivity. But an iOS device will actually check for internet connectivity every 24 hours, or if you go into the company portal and do an application installation, it'll check immediately for any updated policy.
And let me take one quick here, Simon. Other than clicking your slides, I think I should be more useful than that. Can you manage applications using SCCM and Intune? Simon was demonstrating how Intune natively, if you choose to go that route, can actually do the application management. And the answer to that is yes. And then the beauty of that is that you're doing it in the very same way that you're doing for traditional applications in a business environment. Configuration manager, you create the application, you create different deployment types for that application as a part of the application definition. You deploy the application to various collections of devices or users, and then in the case of users that are enabled for mobile device management, they will see in the company portal those applications become available depending upon the device they're on and that deployment type being available to them.
Great question about is the MAM environment a complete environment in which you can regulate data flow? Actually, yes, on iOS it is. It does mean that we can only share data between applications which are managed, i.e. have been wrapped with the management wrapper, and therefore, yes, we have a complete data flow that you can manage on a device. In terms of where users can actually save data to, though, from those applications, that's something you need to think about. Our iOS applications for Word, Excel, and PowerPoint support, at the moment, being able to save to SharePoint and also being able to save to Dropbox. So one of the things that we'll be doing in the future is making it so that you can configure those locations within the application in order to be able to enable the places where users are going to be able to save their applications. Or rather, save their data from their applications. There's an interesting question there from Alfredo about can we include AD and AAD users from Windows Store apps consumers? Not entirely sure what you mean around that, but again, it's a little bit of an aside during an iOS and Android event. But yes, you're going to be able to control application installation using Azure Active Directory accounts. So you won't need to use a Microsoft Store account for a corporate application. You could use access via an Azure Active Directory account. Okay, I think that brings us towards the end of most of the questions that I can see appearing very quickly on the screen here, and we're also about 6 minutes or so over. We're running over a little bit across the entire course, so we're going to leave you with that for a moment, let you go and grab another cup of coffee, and then when you come back, we're going to take a look at Android management from Microsoft Intune and the EMS suite.